Welcome back to the Future Founder Promise podcast. The following is a conversation I had with Guillermo Rauch, the founder and CEO of Vercel. We covered everything from his journey, the Vercel journey, how he scales an organization, how Vercel helps their customers, the infrastructure they come up, how they think about product, how they think about metrics. We dove wide and deep to learn from him on how to build a generation-defining company. I hope you'll enjoy. Guillermo, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me. Really, initially, I want to ask, how are you doing?
Doing great. Just got back from Las Vegas.
Nice.
I were at AWS reInvent. We had the opportunity to speak during the serverless keynote with the VP of Serverless Compute at AWS and talk about how Vercel is helping the ecosystem of developers and companies and enterprises grow their adoption of serverless compute through the front end with Next.js, Vercel, and other tools.
Amazing. That sounds like a ton of fun. I really want to kick us off with a slightly unusual topic, I think, that not a lot of people realize. Over the past many years that I've been following you, have admired your ability to find undiscovered talent and really giving it the space to thrive within Vercel. Specifically, for example, a great example is Tim Neutkens, whom I don't think anyone knew before he joined Zeit and then helped make Next.js a thing, right? Or Javi Velasco, who now has been at Vercel for a long time working on the API. And I'm really curious how you manage to do that. You find these people that no one's ever heard of that are really, really good at what they do, and then you create a space for them to really thrive. What's your secret? How do you find these people, and then how do you foster that environment?
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question, because even as the company has grown and we've become exposed to all kinds of hiring channels and recruiters and things like that, and spoken at universities and recruited from the top companies in the world, I continue to go back to the things that have made Vercel really successful is finding those incredible people wherever they are in the world, working exciting projects. And I think if I had to share the secret sauce, I think a lot of it comes down to community building. So those are folks that took an interest in what we were doing, the things that we were working on in open source. They were contributing in some fashion, or they were using the tools themselves. So it always came down to you're already putting yourself out there through open source, and you are inviting the world to get to know you. And the best hires you can possibly make are the people that already know your tools and how you work. So one of the reasons that I'm bullish about hybrid work, like in office, but also remote, is open source has always been remote first, right? Like you put out a project there and people start collaborating through pull requests and issues and deployment previews and just like sharing ideas around. And you're always building with somebody else out there. And I think our secret really has been spotting what people are building, how they're leveraging our tools, empowering them, working with them even before they join the company. So that was certainly the case with Tim and Javi. So a good examples there, and there are plenty of others.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to think about it, essentially looking at it at the angle from community building. I love that framing. How do you think about creating space for those really great people to thrive inside the company? How do you point them in the right direction and then get out of their way, right? How do you work with those kinds of people and really create that environment where not only they are great people, but they then also thrive within Vercel?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is that, and I think the archetype that you're touching on are people that are really good at just creating products. They have this craftsmanship about the details, the way that they're documented. They listen to customer feedback. They work close with the customer. They identify trends. They're very self-motivated. So I think, to me, it always boils down to giving them product ownership, giving them a lot of business context. If Next.js, and for example, with Tim, I worked super closely on when we became hybrid, dynamic, and static. So for context, Next.js started out being pure server-side rendering. And we had a lot of companies and customers and developers come to us well, I love server rendering, but there's benefits of this kind of CDN distribution and edge distribution of my data. And so we took a look at that and was okay, we're going to invent ISR. And ISR kind of became a huge engine for our business where it gave folks that ability to get some of the benefits that they were getting from static site generation and Jamstack, but also scale up to like billions of pages and make things truly dynamic and empower, marketing teams and content editors, like make changes to the website without having to redeploy it. And that was kind of like me kind of providing some business context to Tim, saying like, hey, like strategically, I think like we need to solve this problem. Look at all this evidence that I'm seeing. Look at like this opportunity in the market. And then just Tim executing and others, of course. But that was kind of the key thing, is that obviously like this is not a company where it's not a collection of individuals, right? We truly work together. But that doesn't mean that you don't have ownership. And the other key thing to me is like well-defined ownership. Like where your responsibilities start and end, and like what are your expectations, and again, always providing that North Star, that feedback, helping the feedback flow within the company, bring back the insights from the field about, okay, why do we close a really big deal with company X? Like let's trace back the breadcrumb and then give the feedback to Tim of like, hey, that thing, or even that page of documentation that you wrote on that topic actually unblocked that thing, that unblocked the next thing, that unblocked the next thing, that unblocked the next thing. So I think it's that like feedback loop always going, and like if I ever spot that it's not working well, that's kind of where like I go in and like try to unblock that.
That just reminded me of this famous meme of like the small domino that eventually just ends up being this massive block of cinder that falls over.
I love that.
That's kind of what that just sounded like.
We should overlay it on the podcast.
Boom.
But, it's funny you should say this, because I'm coming back to that idea again and again and again and again. The other day I was talking with Drew, another huge Drew Breadbrick, another great talent within our team. And we're talking about how we have this massively popular turnkey integration with GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. But when we work with really large companies, the turnkey integration sometimes needs like some adjustment, right? Like, or there's this feature or whatever. So we actually have seen a lot of success in companies integrating into their CI pipelines our Vercel CLI. So instead of giving them the one click, which actually the one click thing is funny because it's the thing that kind of got us to where we are with like over 25,000 paying customers, right? But then there's this like hundreds or maybe like single digit thousands numbers of companies that have extremely complicated. To use another meme, is like, it's that guy that is creating this like massive chain reaction in his kitchen with like duct tape and like this kicks off the next thing, like this like the typical image of like very complicated processes stitched together. So when companies have that kind of setup, that one-click option didn't actually turn out to be that effective. So we kind of went back to our roots. It's like the Vercel CLI is very powerful and very flexible. And we've been making it more flexible as a result of this feedback. And what I was talking with Drew about is that it's incredible how sometimes just the presence or lack thereof of a single flag on that CLI can mean the difference between the Vercel system gets integrated or not into this like maybe one flag can unblock like, and this just happened recently, Vercel becoming the infrastructure provider for one of the largest car companies in the world.
Wow.
So, and yeah, it came down to like, do we have that little, so your point of like the little domino that then brings, like makes everything work is spot on and super present to some of the things that we've been seeing recently.
It almost sounds like the level of abstractions you choose are really important, and you kind of have to cover a spectrum of abstractions, right? For
Correct.
The smaller companies,
I love that.
The one-click integration is beautiful and really helps them, move to Vercel. They're like, look, one click and it works exactly how we need. And then as you go more upmarket into the larger enterprises, suddenly you have the custom needs. But everything is based on the Vercel CLI and API anyway. And so you have these building blocks that you can then remix.
That's a great point, because if we hadn't built that way, what I just said would have not been possible if you don't have the right architecture and if you're not careful about those layers. This is why I think really mature and experienced operators and CEOs and CTOs like to start companies that are API first. So it's not just that like, oh, like Stripe did it, I'm gonna like, bandwagon into like building a company that way. But if you look at OpenAI, everyone's excited about it, right? Like ChatGPT, etc. ChatGPT is a demo built on top of APIs, and their business is that like they have great flexibility to then go into companies or products or teams and be like, how do you want to leverage AI? We have all the levels of abstraction. Mm-hmm. We have do you want to try it for yourself, like as a mock Google replacement, or do you want to peel back the layers and start like integrating into a very sophisticated existing system? And then you see companies like Notion, et cetera. Like we've seen on Vercel, even just in last month alone, this like skyrocketing interest in building AI products. And this would not be possible if there weren't companies like OpenAI, like Replicate.com, et cetera, that are giving you the lower levels of abstraction instead of just giving you like this monolithic system.
That's a beautiful way to think about that. I want to dive into that a little bit more, but let me finish a point on the talent section. I have one more question there, which is very specific. It's a specific element of giving these great people a space to thrive. I've noticed that you promote good people really, really quickly. Recent examples that came to my attention were Bel Curcio, Malte Ubo, Jared Palmer, right? All these names that people in the community will know who came into Vercel doing a certain job and very quickly rose up the sort of, I'm going to call it the corporate ranks, now that you're 400 people, to up their responsibilities and their titles. I'm really curious how that process works for you, and how do you ensure that still keeps happening at the company size that you're at now, where you're no longer even close to managing everybody yourself, right? You're no longer there. You have layers of abstraction. How do you penetrate those, to find those people and help them rise up the ranks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the key thing, or the key insight that always comes back to my mind, is that culture is what you celebrate. So there's two things that we do a lot of. One that is invisible, because if you don't work at Vercel, you're not going to see it, is that if you look at internally what we do, like we talk about technology, we talk about product, we talk about customers, we talk about feedback a lot. But one thing that we do kind of religiously is we share kudos about what things are great, what things that are happening are great, like who's doing something great, who's doing something that lives up to our values. And for example, the example of this morning is Hassan in our developer experience team. He's at NetLope on Twitter, created this incredible website, which is a photo gallery to share the Next.js Conf 2022 photos from our community event. Behind the scenes, there was this process of giving him feedback about how to make it really fast, how to make it work well on multiple devices, how to use our latest cutting edge technologies like our image component, how to scale it up, stress tests that people perform. So the process behind the scene was like quite intense. At one point I gave him some feedback, and then like I kind of forgot about it because I've been super busy, like going to like AWS, reInvent and all these things. And he came out today and is like, it's glorious. And it's not just because I say it, like I was sharing just before this call with the team, like the number of tweets that I got that says, how is this so fast? Oh my God, like it flies. So the most recent tweet I saw before, this is like someone quote tweeted and said, it flies. And this to me was worth celebrating internally quite a bit for a number of reasons. One, it hits on that ownership. So he had this project and he had total creative control over it, total execution control. Another value of ours, which is same team. Like he collaborated with a lot of people that helped him internally to make this so successful. Number three is I truly believe that the best feedback is whatever customers are celebrating. So not totally unique. Like Jeff Bezos said, you double down on customer delight and you embrace external trends quickly. And so whenever we spot that something in the outside world of Vercel is working out really well, we come back and that becomes kind of like an artifact of pride or celebration internally. And I think the other lever that you have when you're working in a large organization is not just like what you're celebrating, but you celebrate through promotions as well. And I think that's where like titles and compensation and other things come in. And I think we do them really quickly when people are improving really quickly or demonstrating value through these things that I talked about really quickly. And that's awesome because that gives them that external reason for celebration. But I think the internal one is even more important.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. How do you even stay so much in the details? There's hundreds of people now working in Vercel doing, I'm sure, a lot of things, right? I'm sure a lot of things are happening inside the company. How do you stay in touch with everything that's happening? How do you even know that somebody's building a photo gallery website for the next conf, right? And how do you then have time to give detailed feedback about it that eventually results in a great website amongst many other people, I'm sure? How does that work?
One reason is that I truly do think that if you want to do great things, there has to be an upper cap to the number of things that you're doing at any given time. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I know about every project that's going on. I know about most things from a high level. I do get really excited personally and try to also spend more time on the things that become kind of like a North Star of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So obviously I spent a lot of time in Next.js Conf because Next.js Conf is kind of like that North Star that tells the world what we're working on, what our values are, and what are the things that are coming. So I spend a lot of time in that. With things that have to deal with that idea of like you put out a product that will scale, right? It'll convey a lot of the things that you want to convey, but at a very large scale, like the product will do the talking. Those are the things that I tend to spend even more time sharing feedback about. But I think the real answer is also that, and I'm going to turn to a really cool interview that happened between Tim Cook at 60 Minutes when he took over Steve Jobs at Apple. He said they were sitting on this like circular table with the interviewer, and he said like, the awesome thing about Apple is that all our products fit on this table. Like we have iPad, we have iPhone, and like, I think really you have to turn most things down and say no to a lot of things. I think that's another thing that people are going to rediscover now because of the financial turmoil, more so that because they were like super disciplined, product-focused, product-obsessed organizations, is that to be truly great, you have to turn things down that are incredibly exciting and awesome, and you have to deepen your ability to execute on the things that you do decide to do. Another thing that happens is that things sometimes should not ship. If something is not great, even if work went into it, it doesn't ship. That's the other trick, is that, you kind of put your energy and effort into kind of like, being honest about like, that's not up to our bar yet. So then it takes a little longer, or it gets refactored in some fashion, and then it goes out. And so I try to stay on top of things because I truly believe that we can't have that many things going on. Otherwise, we're probably not going to be that effective.
I heard this great quote recently, which said, focus is saying no to great ideas, which is exactly what you're hitting on, right? It's like, you have to have focus, but focus means saying no to a bunch of really exciting ideas that I'm sure are great, but instead focusing on one area that you believe you want to win in and going really, really deep in it. That almost makes me think of the sort of going back in history, the change you made to really focus on the front-end space and on Next.js specifically, right? Initially born, Zeit now way back when, out of Node.js hosting, then moving with the Docker hosting, and then really a big change towards more of the front-end Next.js hosting. With sort of the benefit of all of this hindsight and all the experience you've gained, how did you make that decision at the time? And looking back at it, what do you think about it now?
I think one of the key ideas there was what I just mentioned, which is doubling down on whenever you see the light. So we doubled down on Next.js, which started out at almost the exact same time as now. So what's interesting about our story is that in so many ways we're like completely spot on from day one. And in so many areas we're completely off. Like that's what makes it so tricky, and what makes, I think, creating companies difficult. It's like, okay, we're completely spot on in that like the world needed frameworks and platforms that are co-evolved, right? Like we're now seeing that with like Remix and Shopify and Gatsby and Netlify and all kinds of things like that. It's obvious now. Oh, like in order to make the DX of the cloud, the developer experience, as good as possible, you can't just wait until the customer is telling you, oh, by the way, I picked up this framework that I found in open source. How can I make it work with your platform? And you're like, you sit there and it's like, well, I don't know. I've never heard of it. Like, how can we make it work? That's kind of, I think, like what happened with like the first generation clouds. They were kind of waiting for the customers to bring software to them. And then they're very customer obsessive. I mean, I mentioned, like, I'm talking about AWS and Amazon, like companies that are like truly good at what they do, but they were kind of very reactive. Whereas I think the thing that we changed with Vercel and Next.js is that we're very proactive. We're like, here are the tools that we created that work really well with this platform. So I think part of the process wasn't even so much about the technical details, like is it about a file config versus no config? Whereas I think a lot of it was also saying like, we're going to make Next.js work great on Vercel. Let's make it that the starting point. Because then if we can prove that there's delight there, we can start moving to adjacent areas. Of course, now we do Gatsby great, we do Remix great, we do Astro great, we do Vite great. So the flexibility, I think, stayed. It just took a different shape. And I think we learned a lot about how to make a product that could be 10 times better by starting to focus more. So I think I always come back to like another truism that I've never seen not play out, especially in the venture space, is that you typically have to be 10 times better than whatever exists. And it turned out that for us, 10 times better meant this unique integration between front-end framework and platform. On the front-end thing specifically, the other thing that it unlocked that is very strategic to the business is the idea that you're not trying to displace the huge amounts of value that have been created on the back-end side of things, and that you have a more compelling integration story with a huge number of vendors that exist on the marketplace. Like, we do a lot of business with companies like Contentful, Insanity, and Salesforce Commerce Cloud, and like, we kind of integrate into your story instead of, a friend of mine used to call this like and versus or products. Typically, startup products that succeed tend to be and products as opposed to or products. Or means, oh, like, buy my super cool tech, delete everything you have. And products tend to have a very compelling integration point into where you're already at. And that also is downstream from the wisdom that, when you look at, the S1s, like the earnings of like public companies that are in our space, you realize that like the vast majority of the revenue comes from large enterprises. And large enterprises always have this kind of complexity. They always have to add something to the stack. Now, it is true as well that like, I will add a new elaboration on this that I've learned is that the best kind of end product is a product that introduces itself as an end product and then becomes a total or product, right? Like, because like you bring Stellate into our cloud, and it's like non-threatening. It's just caching here, more observability there, like, security features over here. And then, turns out like I can build more things with this thing. And it's now my platform for how I manage all my data flows within the company. So I think those are kind of like you have to think very long-term and almost be like very disciplined and like put a cap on yourself on the scope in the early days, such that you can have that smooth transition to that or product.
It's interesting because that almost strikes me as counter to the sort of common advice that particularly in B2B enterprise sales, replacing a line item in the budget is much easier than adding a new line item.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So it's almost you're almost saying the opposite, right? And you're saying, hey, as a product company, it's much easier for us to get into these companies if we add something versus if we replace something existing.
Yeah, and I think the way to do that is that there are a lot of folks that have opportunities to make decisions that are not perfectly falling into whatever the company has already purchased. right? Like I'm starting up a new project, I'm starting a new initiative. That's where like I see most of startups in the B2B space tend to have success. And what ends up happening too is that new thing looks completely different. So it's very hard to say like, oh, but we already bought X that already does that. Well, then you get into the details and you realize, no, it doesn't do it at all, right? And then you've inserted yourself, and over time you can displace more of that existing workload. And that's why, by the way, front end also plays into that thesis, because it's actually certain that like most companies that we sell into have purchased compute and other resources from an existing big cloud vendor. What they haven't purchased is that specificity into a problem domain. And that's what, like, in fact, we've noticed now that like what's starting to happen is that we are becoming the category of the line item that gets filled with us or hopefully us, but there's other vendors in there. And like what happened in our category is that I think that line item wasn't spoken for. So in the early days, it was a bit of an uphill battle, because it's like, well, I've been working with AWS since 2006. Why should I work with you guys? You know what I mean? But that was even true for React. I don't know if you remember the early reactions. Like, I've been working with jQuery Inc. for the last 10 years. Like, why should I pay attention to this? And I think what React did well that fits this thinking is that it actually looked completely different. Like, there weren't that many analogies to it. And that also goes back to my 10 times better thesis, is that React looked different enough that a lot of the early reactions to it were like complete misconceptions, which is why like I think that the program thing about like it's good if people regard it as a toy, or like basically kind of like you want to aim for the category of reactions that are somewhat dismissive. Arguably, I think we're seeing this with OpenAI, where like the releases just keep getting more remarkable. But if you trace back, like there were all this like naysayers saying, but like, look at this, it says that 2 + 2 is like 5 or whatever, like, and it just keeps getting better and better and better. So it has to look very different. And then when it actually gets tested or applied, it has to be significantly better to succeed.
That makes a ton of sense. You also just reminded me of a point that we were talking about earlier, where you said, you know, we built Vercel and we made it the best platform for Next.js, but equally, it works equally well with Astro and Stellate and whatever else and all these other frameworks. And again, you chose the right level of abstraction, right? You made sure that all the levels of abstractions were covered, and you probably, looking at it from the outside, you were informing what the abstractions need to look like based on your own experience, right? You built it for Next.js, and then through that, you built the right layers of abstraction so that you could replicate that experience later.
And that truly took a lot of intellectual effort. So like, I remember like things, in terms of things being hard, I actually remember discrete moments in time when I remember thinking like, holy crap, like the engineering effort, the thinking, the planning, the data stores, the metadata, the config, like everything would be so much easier. But I actually think this is a good illustration as well of like, simple versus easy, which I'm kind of like OCD about, you know, trying to be as correct as possible when I use the two terms. And like, I think this is a good example. Like, it would have been easier. It wouldn't necessarily have been the simpler thing to do, because I think simplicity speaks to this elegant system where the infrastructure primitives are nicely decoupled from the front-end framework implementation detail. Now, that wasn't easy at all. It turns out, like, the easy thing would have been to, like, create this mesh of a system of Next and Next Cloud. And I would have closed deals faster, perhaps, or, I don't know, like, get more market share. I don't know what would have happened. But, like, I do think I would have some, like, super short-lived advantages. This actually, by the way, this simplicity translates into, like, going back to like giving ownership to folks, and like you kind of want to design a company that is not too detached from how the engineering works. So famously, Jeff Bezos said, you know, we're going to organize ourselves as teams that speak over APIs. So the ways that modern organizations are structuring themselves are intrinsically related to how they engineer. So going back to like Next and Vercel, like the fact that we have this really cool API, we call it the build output API, that binds any arbitrary front-end framework to our infrastructure, has made for a more neatly organized, I would even dare say autonomously organized and productive engineering organization as well. And so you have to be super mindful of that alignment between product, engineering, the thing that you're building, and how teams organize around it.
That's a really powerful insight. How do you think about, I think some companies tend to fall into the trap of engineering for engineering's sake, right? They end up thinking that the only thing that matters is that you engineer it really well and everything is architected perfectly, but you never ship anything. How do you balance sort of like the engineering it simply in an elegant system with shipping quickly?
For sure. This is a huge topic. So I have a couple ideas. One is that you have to be very clear about what are your crown jewels. You know, like what is the thing that you're here to protect? And what does protecting them mean? So I'll give you a very concrete example for us is that we have this internal prioritization framework that says like the absolute most important thing for the company is security and the security of our customers' data. And closely following that is durability, which is like not losing their data, and availability, which is like ensuring that our customers are productive, both on the deployment pipeline, like they can push code and change things, and also that we're serving their traffic without interruptions in production. So if an engineer is wanting to make a change, they have this like value system that they can refer to about how careful do they need to be, how, of course, we all want perfect, masterful, amazing engineering for everything, but some things will necessarily have more scrutiny. And in our cases, like those crown jewels that relate to, that have that framework of prioritization attached to them. So I think it boils down to like setting clear expectations about like what's worth having that extra set of eyes on. However, having said that, another thing that can give you velocity so there's two other things that can give you velocity without sacrificing quality. One, we already talked about, scope. Like I'm just going to build less. I'm going to cut that out. In fact, I had to make a hard decision recently where I weighed in on some arbitrage and I said, I'd rather this be GA without those two other features because we get it to market earlier. We focus on all the right things because we're coming to market with saying like we've improved stability and performance of this product. And it's basically faster and better. And we can keep adding the rest of the other features later. So let's cut down scope, meet our date, get it to market. It's super strategic. It's super awesome. I know how to speak to its awesomeness when I sit down with an analyst or customer or friend or whatever. So let's ship it. So scope reduction was a tool there. And the other one that I would say is like getting things into customers' hands with the right caveats and expectations as aggressively as possible. So experimental flags, boom. Like Chrome does this really well, right? Like there's a lot of stuff in there. Like Chrome for me is exceptional. Like never crashes. Like I never go to like a critical website like my bank account or Gmail and like it's bad or whatever. Clearly they understand what their crown jewels and key metrics are. But then they have like thing like I didn't even have like 300 experimental flags that I'm sure if I check them all on, it's going to turn my browser into a disaster, right? I think that's how you want to do software at scale. You want to like create this like super awesome, well-defined, kind of like yellow brick road to production that is not binary. So what's really cool about this insight is that we're turning this insight into a technology with Vercel because we want to give you this feature flag oriented way, this very dynamic way of enabling and disabling features, even for cohorts of users while you build with Next.js and Vercel. So we just announced the Edge Store. The Edge Store allows you to store metadata everywhere in the world. And when you make a change to it, it gets pushed everywhere instantly. So that's a good storing system for things like, I'm going to enable this new capability just for Max. So I say like feature, new kind of Vercel deployment enabled for Max. Now Max has it, I can start receiving feedback from him. And if it creates problems, it literally takes 300 milliseconds to roll it back. I don't actually even have to redeploy. So that's the kind of technology investment. Obviously, I'm selling Vercel, but like that's the kind of technology investment that if you give that to your team, they can move fast with confidence. Because now they're starting to like have this smooth rollout process. If something goes wrong, it gets instantly rolled back. We actually also announced instant rollbacks recently. 300 millisecond worldwide reverting of an entire deployment. That's the kind of thing that gives our customers a lot of confidence. And by the way, there's a meta story there because we rolled out instant rollback under a flag. And we heard from this car company that like literally what this, and this is what I like the doubling down on customer delight thing. One day I saw this Slack message that someone shared that said, OMG, this feature literally saved this really important release for us. Thank you so much for making it. You know what's interesting about that, and goes back to the tweets about Hassan's work? When people go out of their way to tell you that you're doing something well, that in my mind, I attach a lot of weight to it. They're super busy. They were dealing with a launch. Obviously, there was some bugs, so it wasn't even like an entirely positive situation. But the fact that that feature existed changed their level of confidence, their love for our platform, etc. And those are the things that I think we all make mistakes. So like, how can you create systems within your organization that contain the blast radius of those mistakes and actually empower people to feel good about making mistakes? This is the concept of psychological safety. I don't want to get too like Harvard Business Review on our audience here, but like the study that came out, I think was from research at Google, was the best performing teams are the ones that feel the most psychologically safe. What is a proxy for psychological safety? That you're allowed to make mistakes. And again, that's why I made that framework of like your crown jewels, not okay to make mistakes under absolutely no circumstances. But then create room for mistakes to be made and like contain the blast radius of those mistakes and learn very quickly and then move forward with confidence and so on.
Man, there was so much in there. I feel like one of the things that Vercel is known for, but also you personally, I think, are renowned for, is staying at the cutting edge of what's happening in the industry, right? I think Vercel has continuously over the last, I don't know how many years it's been at the complete forefront of the industry, thinking ahead to what people are going to need, 2, 5, 10 years down the line, and building that now so that it exists today and giving it to everyone. And I'm curious, how do you actually stay that far ahead of the industry, and how are you always at the cutting edge of everything? Guillermo, is essentially what I'm asking. Well, right? How do you stay there continuously for such a long time?
I'm probably not, but on everything. But I'll tell you the things that, this goes back to focus. The other thing that makes a ton of sense about us focusing on the front end ecosystem is that we can see into the future because we have a level of expertise. We have the ability to even know how things that we don't own are built. Our CTO Malte spent 11 years working at Google. He's seen every variety, configuration, flavor of front-end frameworks at Google, including all the things that didn't work. That's actually what I love hearing the most stories about. Like when you work for an organization of that size, there's at any given time 10 teams trying out 10 different things, right? So you can extract patterns from that. But even before I had that privilege, I was constantly reverse engineering how successful things were being built. I actually wrote this article, The 7 Principles of Rich Web Applications. A lot of those insights that people like to point out, like, oh my God, you wrote that in 2014 is so present time. And I was like, yeah, it's present time because like I looked at a lot of big things like Amazon, like Google search, I spent an obsessive number of hours reverse engineering, learning, applying my own knowledge, and then extracted some commonalities between those things. So it's like, it's work that ChatGPT would do in like 2 seconds these days. But for my time, it was like very important to validate my assumptions with what's already working at scale. I think this is one of the things that if there's anything that's easy, because there's absolutely nothing, but if there's anything that's like at least has a chance of being easy in our field, is the asymmetry that exists in information propagation. It's like high frequency trading, right? Like if you're too far from the source, you're gonna like lose, but like there's arbitrages that are possible. So one arbitrage that exists today is that companies like Google, Amazon, Meta, Airbnb, etc., have figured a lot of things out that the vast majority of organizations that are going through the process of becoming technology companies have not figured out. Mm-hmm. So that's how I stay on the cutting edge. It's like part of my job is to backport what I've already seen that works and to democratize. I know that people object to that word. Sometimes it gets overused in the context of startups, but I do think that there is a big part of our job that does democratize technology access. The other one that is less boring, but I think equally, to me, it's really exciting, is that customers always know what's ahead and what's good for them. And obviously you might find the odd engineer that tells you like, you know what, like things used to be better in my time. We used to write everything in COBOL and transpile JavaScript. Like you do. I'm not saying that every individual within every customer group is absolutely spot on. But overall, companies are, especially when you start working with successful companies that are not yet so successful as being technology companies, they know what's best for their business. In fact, they have a lot to teach you because they bring insights from just like how to run good companies at scale. Like we work with a lot of the largest retailers in the US. Perhaps they're not the best .com makers of the world yet because they haven't all implemented Vercel yet, but they do know how to run a company for generations. So there's a lot of things to learn. And typically when I talk to them, they know exactly what they want. They know in fact, one thing that I've learned is that when you tap into tech Twitter for front end, is so kind of like, it oversimplifies most issues that companies at scale have. I'll give you the best example, Lighthouse scores. If I show a customer a Lighthouse score, like a very at-scale customer a Lighthouse score, and it says 30, maybe literally at this point in time of their evolution, it's 30 because they have an ad-backed business, and there's absolutely nothing they can do about certain ads that they have to display on their homepage. So it can be very almost like immature or irrational to browse Twitter because it oversimplifies every business problem that these companies at scale have. And then that's why engaging in dialogue with those customers and truly understanding what actually moves the needle for them is what brings me back to like, okay, let's come back and innovate or create something really cool for them that's going to solve that problem. So Edge Config is a good example in that when we look at why a lot of our customer sites are slow, it might be that they're loading megabytes of third-party JS to do experiments on the client side. And literally the only way that they can become faster is by put that logic at the edge and on the server. However, that also seems like an oversimplification. Why weren't they doing that today if it's so obvious, right? Oh, it's just moving the code from the client to the server. Well, because the infrastructure to make that cheap, cost-effective, easy, global, literally did not exist. And that's why we're innovating on things like edge functions. No cold boots, massive scale-up ability, like super cost-effective. So that's a good example of like the customer did know what the cutting-edge thing would be, or at least they had a very good clarity in the requirement. It's just that we had to like backport it to an innovation. So backporting from customers or from things that are already working out there in the wild is a lot of what our job becomes.
That makes me wonder, how much time do you spend with customers? Or actually, maybe a slightly more broad question, what does a typical day in Guillermo Rauch's life look like? Like if you were to lay out your typical day or week, what does that look like? How do you distribute your time?
It's hard to say typical because so much of this job is atypical. Like, for example, like opportunities that come our way, and one day I woke up and it's like, oh, we can speak at a web summit in front of one of the largest stages in the world. It's like, okay, I have to go to Portugal next week, like things like that. So there are a lot of things that are like not super typical. I'm going to nerd out for like a minute and then I'm going to answer the question. So
yes,
having created Next.js and Vercel, I love this model of what we call infrastructure from code or infrastructure as code, which means that you tell Vercel what you want and then Vercel converts it into something. It's like terraforming, right? So for example, in Next.js, you create a middleware file and then you deploy it into Vercel, and that becomes global edge middleware. You didn't even told us any config or infrastructure as code. You literally just wrote your application, deployed it, and it became optimal infrastructure. So I love declarative systems like that. You say, what do you want? And then you make a scheduler or an orchestrator do the work. So what I want is to spend 1/3 of my time with customers, 1/3 of my time driving change internally. Driving change internally means organizations are constantly evolving and learning new insights from both the market and, your own experiments and thoughts and ideas. And so you're driving the change. You're speaking at all hands. You're writing up a document. You're giving kudos. You're doing things that drive change and evolution forward. And then so I covered driving change internally, communicating externally with my customers. And then the third is where I give myself more flexibility, whether it's community building, giving feedback to the product teams, bringing my own insights, because there are CEOs that kind of have a bias and or a preference of where they want to bring value. And like for me, I was the original customer for a product, and I spend a lot of time with customers and with developers to continue to be their voice within the organization. So I spend time learning about our products, helping folks translate product evolutions into how do you communicate and talk about this product. So you've seen me, I spend a non-trivial amount on Twitter, right? Like communicating with the world about our product is a non-trivial amount of what I do. And I actually spend a lot of time planning. Like sometimes before the technology, the code even exists, I'm trying to plan, how am I going to talk about this? What are the metaphors that I'm going to give the world to make sense of this? In fact, I found that the metaphor is one of the most powerful things that we can use as technologists because we have such a broad audience. It starts with our parents, right? I think you mentioned your parents in one of your interviews as being a very important part of your assisting your entrepreneurship career. And so I need to be able to speak to them about what I'm doing. And I need to be able to speak to, report at a large scale news website. And I need to be able to speak on Twitter. And I need to be able to understand this as a developer myself. So kind of being the voice of the company is that a big part of that remaining chunk.
So 1/3 talking to customers, 1/3 driving change internally, and then 1/3 that's kind of flexible, but falls into many different pieces. A lot of which is around communicating product changes.
Correct.
Understanding the product, living with developers.
And living in the product as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think about your focus as a CEO, which seems very product communication focused, how do you think about the other areas of the business? How do you supplement your own strength in the product and sort of communication area with team members? And then how do you make them successful? I imagine a world in which you are solely focused on the product, right? And everybody else feels left behind. That obviously wouldn't lead to success. So how do you balance that focus of yours and that priority of yours with having to build a company that has many other areas as well internally?
Yeah, I mean, there's really only one solution to that problem, which is that you have to hire extraordinary leaders that you can develop very close trust relationships with. Because you had a very good point. Like if you spend all this time on that thing that you like to do, then you're sacrificing some other time on that thing that you don't like to do. So inevitably the answer is trust in great leaders. Because like if I'm not spending any time, like I have to be able to know that you're doing an exceptional job at that thing. Because like it's not that I lower the quality bar, right? Like I actually want that to be as high as possible, and giving feedback. So that's a big part of also the driving change one, the second of the three, which is that for all of the jobs that you're not doing, you have to provide stellar feedback so that, are they aligned with that change that we're trying to drive, or, is that thing living up to our values or to the level of excellence? I think that I always take issue with is how good is the cover letter for this product? How good is the blog post? How good is the hyperlink that takes you to the CTA to you start using it? How good is the onboarding process? So like spend time on that and give feedback.
How do you give feedback for the areas where you're not as deeply involved? Like I imagine you bring in a really seasoned go-to-market executive or operations executive or whatever.
The way that I like to think about that is the colleague at Vercel is the customer. So like you hear that, X thing could have been better. Like when new folks come into the company, I ask them like, how good was the onboarding? When an engineer onboards, I ask them like, how quickly did you get ramped up with new tools? When I talk to sales reps, I talk to marketing folks. Sales reps love to hear how quickly contracts are being signed, and how smooth the process is, and how good enablement is, how good sales engineering is, and so I spend time as part of the second bucket, which is like the internal time that I spend. I gather feedback about areas that I'm not currently involved in or thinking that much about.
Oh, that's interesting. How do you find these really exceptional leaders? What do you look for? What has worked and what has not worked?
What has not worked is doing the like classic, referral checking, look at the resume, have a bunch of conversations, like not really going above and beyond. I think the most important thing to me is that these hires are not just expensive from a monetary perspective. They're expensive in like the inertia that they bring with them. They will bring ways that they do things. They bring biases. They bring methods, ideas, preconceptions, people that they like to work with. Like these are like the most, the hires were like, it's worth spending a lot of time on. It's worth ensuring value alignment from the outset. It's my framework tends to be like no or hell yeah for anything, but with this kind of hire, it's definitely been like, if it's not any very extreme hell yeah, it's absolutely no. Another thing that's worked well for me is doing simulations of what a work problem would have been with those people. Like, let's solve this problem collaboratively together and see how we can improve, or how we could solve it. And then in that process, I get a sense of like how well we would work together. I care a whole lot about how people communicate, and it's been a very positive heuristic for me. Whether they're accurate with words, whether when they don't know something, they are curious instead of trying to ignore it, or maybe not pretend that they know it, but like be almost like professional about it and like not be like concrete. Like, I do not understand your question or what you just said. Can you clarify that better? I tend to like folks that are coming into something new. They have to be extremely curious, and they have to it's very likely they're not going to know a whole lot. So how quickly am I working on synchronizing my state with their state is a good heuristic.
That almost makes me wonder, what's fueling you? Why do you do what you do?
So I've had the fortune of finding something that I think is at that intersection of like I'm good at and I'm obsessive about and I'm passionate about, right? Like I've been working on this kind of front-end technologies for so long. I've had the need and want to scale myself. Like nowadays, I don't go to that many conferences. I used to go to so many a year teaching people things manually. Like that, going back to that article, like I wrote 7 principles and it took you like 2 hours to read that article. I want to create technologies that scale myself. So I'm very motivated to see the web succeed. I've been working on the web. The web has, I owe things to the web. So I think going back to like the passion, it's like there's a true sense of purpose because it's created my career. It's connected me to the world. Like it gave me my first job when I was like 12, 13 or whatever. So there's a sense of like giving back. There's a sense of like, I love this. I'm good at this. I can hire people that are even better at me technically. So like what a privilege to be able to work with folks like that. And the other thing I think is really rewarding is just always being surprised by what customers are doing with it. I think this is probably the dream of every entrepreneur, which is that a customer walks up to you and tells you how you're changing their life. Or you spot it out there in the wild. And that nowadays, luckily for us, happens on a regular basis. Like, 2 days ago at reInvent, someone walked up to me and he was like, I'm the VP of engineering for this company. It's a media streaming company. They create some of the best shows and movies that a lot of people are a fan of. And he's like, oh, and now we just deployed Next.js on Vercel to all Samsung TVs in North America. Wow. And I was like, well, first of all, I didn't know that Samsung TV had Chromium in there and like web rendering capabilities, turns out. And second, it's like, how cool is that? Like, I never had talked to this person before, and because the product worked well, it guided them to that kind of success or ambition. And that's one of the things that like I set out to do. Like, I want to create technology that just like scales in its own right. And so you have this confirmation, maybe not every day of this magnitude, like how like stories of that are so novel or interesting. I was at Web Summit and someone walked up to me to say like, I'm helping this wine conglomerate launch dozens of companies and accelerate their M&A, and they maintain all these like wine and beverage related companies all in one Next.js code base on Vercel. And they showed me the back end of this like multi-site setup. And I was like, I didn't know we could do that with that platform. Like, of course, like technically I knew it was possible, but when they showed it to me, it was like showing me the dashboard of a plane, and I've been creating the fuselage, like I've been creating like the materials, mm-hmm. And now you're showing me this massive thing. So I think that's one of the things that like provides a lot of motivation. And then even the small things, like an individual developer doing something really cool. So the other day, someone created this this app on Vercel where you would connect your Spotify account, and it would create the poster that looks like a festival. Like with the leading band and all the like secondary bands and whatever, and like with this really cool like psychedelic like festival look, and it went absolutely viral. One person, a student, created this marvelous idea. It's like, so fun to like imagine if you were creating your festival with your favorite bands and like you're creating this poster, and it went absolutely viral. Like we're talking like celebrities sharing theirs on Instagram, trending on Twitter, just like blowing up. And it was on Vercel, and like that empowerment of a single person to reach the entire world. That's why I fell in love with like serverless and Edge and these things. It's like I knew that the technology could do that if applied correctly, and now we're seeing it happen. So like those are the things that like every day like give you that confirmation and motivation. Conversely, by the way, there's nothing more motivating than seeing like something that's not working and you have to fix it and there's an opportunity. So someone last night, I think, or 2 nights ago, was like, I can't figure out for the love of me how to solve this routing issue on Vercel. Like what's going on Vercel? And I'm mentioning this because I'm happy that we're able to help them very quickly and they're happy, they said. But also because like not everything is positive feedback. Like you have to also face the, negative feedback and like what's not working. In fact, I try to start more of my customer syncs. I try to start them all with like, what's not working? What could we be doing better? What's the next big obstacle that your company or your business has, and how is Vercel helping? Because sometimes, and I don't want to get too derailed into that, but like sometimes you don't know what the customer's ambitions are, and that maybe you could have helped them, but they misinterpreted the surface of your product or how much you could help them. So just seeking feedback that's negative, also in the sense of like, why you're not using my product? I could be helping you.
That reminded me of a story that happened really early on in Stellate's life, where we were still in the private beta. We built the graphical edge caching, and we got our very first ever private beta user of the service. And it's a big sports website down in Australia that is basically the central repository for all the information related to that sport. And so the developers that work there, they love that sport, right? They're huge fans of the sport. They want to watch every single match.
Yes.
But the problem was, as soon as there was a match, of course, there was a traffic spike. And their infrastructure could not handle the traffic spikes. And so these developers that love these sports, that want to watch the match, every single time there was a match, they were stuck just having to fix their infrastructure. And they put the edge cache in front of their service, and it completely alleviated the traffic spike for them. And then they sent us a message. I will never forget this. They sent us a message, and they literally said, we can finally watch these sport matches again.
Amazing.
And that to me was where I was like, wow, we've got something here, right? Like if we can change even just one person's life like this, if we can make their life better in this way, if we can scale it up and find more people like them, that's what I want to do in life, right? That gives me, even just now telling the story just gives me a sense of warmth. And I got the same sense from you as you were telling me your stories. Yeah,
it's so funny because I have noticed this in myself where if I go to a site, maybe they're not using Vercel, and like I really care about that thing, I want to see it get better, no matter what. So I love that because I've had situations where if you can find that alignment between your customer's goal and something that you care deeply about, and you complement that, obviously they care about getting the best possible information for that sport out into the world. That's the mission of their company. And, your mission is to enable folks like that. And you happen to care about that as well. Like those are the things that make it such an awesome match. And that's why over the years, I've really, really reconfigured my mind to think about customers as true partners of building a great thing together. In fact, I celebrate their wins as mine when they deploy something that's really fast. I gave compliments to the Okta team recently because they launched a new strategic initiative. And the website, landing page, etc., playground was on Vercel, and I was like, I didn't know it was on Vercel when I first checked it out. I was like, A, this looks great. B, it's really fast. I'm happy that it's on our technology, but I went and talked to them. I found out who created that within Okta, and I gave them even further advice about like, and there's this detail here, like we could make it even better for you. And then I got more feedback from them because if there was something that was off about that, and these are extremely intelligent, capable people at one of the hottest tech companies in the world, why did Next.js or Vercel not do that automatically for them? So going back to like how I can bring interesting insights about the outside world to Vercel, that's a really good example. I try to contextualize. I'm like, we're going to be helping out companies that, are not the foremost experts in technology in the world. And that's why we're going to help them. We're going to like pharmaceutical companies that perhaps don't know anything about front end yet. How come this other company that is truly a tech pioneer couldn't, I don't know what the issue was, but like, let's say that it's rendering fonts really fast, or like, why did their system not guide them to adopt @next/font? And they had to figure out for themselves. So I try to spend time thinking about like backwards from the output of and I think this is also what's really cool about Vercel is that we typically produce artifacts that companies put out there into the world. And that makes it easier for us to share in their success or their shortcomings, if any.
How do you think about those feedback loops? I feel like I'm hearing a lot, also when you mentioned a third of your time is spent on driving change internally. You spend so much time with customers, you gather all this feedback. How do you think about these feedback loops? How do you ensure that all of that gets heard and actually is actionable? How do you drive that change based on what you're hearing? How do you bring that into the organization and bring the whole team along? Because ultimately, your whole team is going to have to hear that story. Because if they don't understand why they're making a change, the change isn't going to be right, I think, personally. And so how do you make that happen?
Yeah, there are several tools, but I think it all starts with like yearly and quarterly planning and sharing the key metrics of the company, right? Like these are 3 strategic initiatives for the year, and this is how we are attaching like measurable quantities to them. And then kind of the application and reinforcement of that framework over time. So that's like from yearly planning to like quarterly planning, to, in our case, bi-weekly all hands, where like we get together as a company and like we're like, okay, like how are we doing against these goals? But there's other tools, as I mentioned. Even like what you celebrate is a tool that influences behavior, because what ends up happening is like, oh, I want to be more. I also want to be celebrated. Like it's like if you're playing a team sport, like, what you're seeking is to become number one. You want to seek whatever is working for the players that are winning. You want to like be celebrated like the teams that are winning. Like it's very obvious in sports. It's not so obvious in corporations, right? Like what is the score? What does winning mean? So I think bringing context to like, well, winning means, what I mentioned just now, like doing great things for our customers. Winning to us means our customers growing, our customers using our product, activating our product, obviously revenue, giving us compensation in accordance with the value that we're bringing, expanding accounts. Expansion is something I care a lot about because our product is super reusable, right? Like if you use it for one project, it should be used for the next 10. In fact, what's really cool about the Okta thing that I mentioned is this is probably like their 20th project on Vercel. And I care about the 20th as much as I care about the first. I think it's actually kind of cool because like a lot of companies are like, okay, the customer signed. They didn't even activate the product. Cool. On to the next win. You know what I mean? I like to deepen relationships. I like to really see the product work out for people. So there are a bunch of tools that have to do with like how to reinforce awesome, desirable behaviors and that are going to affect those metrics positively.
Very concretely, how have your metrics, what have you learned about setting good goals and good metrics over time? Because I imagine that was also a learning process. What has changed over the years? When you look back at the beginning of Vercel, what were you measuring then and what are you measuring now? And what is that diff? Where does that come from?
This could be an entire podcast in its own right, because it's a non-trivial topic, right? Like, so I'm gonna give some ideas that I have about it. One is that fewer metrics that everybody has access to and that guide the company is better and more. So if you have too many, it's completely overwhelming and people like cannot make sense of like the relative importance of them, which one is kind of like a superset metric, and which ones are like implementation detail metrics. So it has to be like a pyramid where like there are lots and lots and lots of metrics of like different teams, even individuals perhaps. And then that bubbles up to like fewer and fewer and fewer. So I started out just because I care so much about every aspect of the product, and because I've created so many of the initial surface of the product, like having every single metric available to me makes sense. But then spending, 10 slides of a presentation going over lots and lots and lots of metrics is not as effective. Similarly, the quality of the metrics is hard. Like a metric is like a product almost. Maybe I should even remove the almost. It's a product. So it requires quality control. It requires that you truly understand the metric, and if the data points of them are correct or not. Like, have you randomly sampled them to understand if like, oh, last night we grew by 80%. Is that true? Do you grow by 80%, or like is the metric like not working that well, or like was there an anomalous event that we have to account for? Like, you have to dig deep. You have to market it, right? Like a product has to be marketed, and like a metric has to be marketed. Like, to your point, like you have to explain why that metric is so important, where it came from, how it's defined. You have to be able to reference that documentation for that metric and understand it. It needs an integration story, right? Like how does this product or metric fit in to our existing portfolio of metrics or things that I care about? What are and going back to like products have internal components. So like if there's a top level metric, what are the leading indicators of it? What are the internal components that we measure? Because one of our metrics is like monthly active domains. If I only care about that, but I'm not monitoring internal things that make people want to push their applications on Vercel, like time to first byte at the edge, or other things that make for someone to want to use this system to begin with, those have to be metrics that other people own. Perhaps they don't get like shared with everybody in the company every time at every all hands or every presentation, but they're extremely important. And then again, maybe another metaphor is like a metric is like a puppy. Like, it's awesome, they're cute, they're like it's great to see them grow, but it's a huge responsibility. If I give you a metric, if I give you a puppy, like now like it's gonna grow into a full-blown beast that you have to maintain. So I try to be very rigorous with the cross-examination of metrics. And similarly, I expect people to, going back to that ownership, I expect people to be owners of the numbers. And that means that you know them at pretty much all times. Oh, and you have a good kind of like peripheral vision of all the adjacent metrics that are important to that. So if I work on the Vercel build pipeline, I have an awareness of the activity at the edge, because this is very related to that. So, however, I'm not going to ever expect you to know, like, if you worked on that, like, you're going to know some other, like, internal metric of some other team, right? But your own key metric you should know extremely well. And that even, what's really interesting is that even like something like time to first byte can break down to 20, 30, 50 internal metrics of the subsystems that make up for a good time to first byte. And all the customer scenarios, like, it's obvious that like, if I'm, deploying a workload for a Fortune 500 company, I'm owing up to a certain quality of service that, even though their number in the altogether volume might be not super representative, like we're talking about like some of our largest deals might be 0.0000001% of traffic. So that's what I was saying about the puppy, is like, it's hard to even put the systems in place sometimes to, and going back to why it's a product as well, even just instrumenting things takes a lot of work. And ascertaining the quality of the metric takes a lot of work. A lot of customers get value from the increased productivity that they get on Vercel, right? And that's why, like, for example, like, we care deeply about the customers that are not yet in production because they're building towards a big launch. We have customers that have great seasonality, right? Like Black Friday is like, we just saw this, like Black Friday is insane. And then like their traffic might fluctuate down, or they have big upcoming launches. I do think that there's always a correlation with usage, but it's not always the one thing that the customer is getting out of a platform.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense. And then I want to tie us off with one last topic that I realize is a really long topic, but you personally have gone from being the software engineer to now running this hundreds of people, very, very far along company. What has your evolution been like? What are some of the big lessons that you've learned over the last years, going from being that developer who, you know, in your history, you've done some really great work that a lot of people know, your writing, but also your open source work. And then going from that to where you are now, what are some of the really big lessons that you've learned along the way?
I think the biggest one is that I, as a framework builder of bits and bytes, I had to learn what are the frameworks that make me just as efficient and productive as a developer that picks Next.js. What are the frameworks that do that for companies? Whether it's, you know, setting up expectations, whether it's your values, whether it's onboarding, whether it's all hands. What are the rituals? What are the processes, best practices, and how do you package that into a great user experience at the end of the day? So I had to learn, and I'm still learning because we're not quite there yet. Like we have so much more growth ahead of us. And what are the right frameworks for each stage of the company? So if we're not yet a 10,000 person organization, we should not have a framework for a 10,000 person organization. Conversely, we have to be ready. We have to be developing an awareness of what that next stage is and what are the right tools for it. And the other thing that I've learned is that we do have to find the implementation that makes the most sense to our culture and that is most authentic to our culture and to our mission. I always come back to our mission. Like everything I try to implement through the point of view of a company is trying to make the web better. For example, corporate responsibility. How can we make the world better? Generally, how can we help and support nonprofits and causes that we care about? But at the same time, how can we infuse that with our mission? Because we're here to make the web better and faster and enable developers to create incredible things. So that's another big takeaway for me is that I think authenticity and transparency, huge assets for us in just getting everyone aligned and moving in the same direction. To your point earlier, like there's no way at this point that I can like sync individually with like 400 folks, right? So like, how can we, develop frameworks that give me that kind of scalability?
That's a nice way to think about it, which goes back to the engineering mindset, right? Like, how do I build something for the scale that I'm at? Whether that's bits and bytes or that's humans. Ultimately, you have to build the systems that enable you to scale to that size.
Yeah, and within the best engineers will have the awareness of like, and I know exactly when this breaks down, and I need that other system. So it's a very good metaphor.
I love it, Guillermo. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. Is there anything else that you want to plug or tell our audience that you want them to know, that you want them to go to, listen to, visit, do? What's the one thing that you would plug here? And before I let you go, and thank you for spending all this time with us. Go to vercel.com/blog, and I'd love to hear your feedback about all the recent products that we've been putting out, whether it's Edge Config or Edge Functions or some of the new announcements that we have with Next.js 13. Curious to hear how everyone's what everyone's creating with them as well. Amazing. Thank you so much for joining, Guillermo. It's been an honor to have you. I hope we get another episode or 2 or 10 in where we can dive deeper into some of these topics that might make for individual episodes. See you then next time.
Thank you, Max.